Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions at A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Winston-Salem is the fifth largest city in North Carolina. But before 1913, it didn't technically exist. Until then, it was two separate townships, Salem and Winston. In 1753, the Moravian Church purchased the Wachovia Tract, a 100,000-acre plot of land in North Carolina. About a dozen men came down from the Moravian settlement in Pennsylvania and quickly set up the temporary township of Bethabara. The designer in Pennsylvania had sent town layout drawings with the settlers, and after establishing Bethabara, they explored the area in search of the perfect location to build more permanent towns. Once a location had been selected, construction began on Salem. The architectural plans divided the town into two halves, East Salem and West Salem. The eastern side, best known today as Old Salem, housed the church and many Moravian craftsmen, while West Salem contained industries and farms. One key feature for any permanent settlement is water. So in the area of what is now Muddy Creek and Canvasback Lake, they built Bethania. And at the confluence of two other creeks, they built Salem. Those two creeks they named Peters Creek and Salem Creek. The name Salem was derived from shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. It's fair to say that several of the area's residents have failed to find any peace in death. The first known haunt of Salem was George Stockburger, a once wealthy farm owner who had fallen on bad times. One day, workers at the paper mill found him half dead on the banks of Peters Creek. They called the mill owner, who sent for the town doctor. It was several days before George was strong enough to tell them his story. You see, in those days, the terrain that made up the Wachovia Tract was quite different from modern-day Winston-Salem. Many hills and steep ravines covered much of the area. Caves dotted the walls of many of these ravines. All of these caves have been lost over the years as the ravines were filled in and the ground flattened to make way for ever-expanding construction. But in the late 1700s, Peters Creek had been dammed to create Peters Mill Pond, which fed the paper mill. Peters Mill Pond, which is now known as Peters Creek Parkway, led to the mill via Peters Mill Bridge at the head of Peters Mill Pond. Yeah, I know. That's a lot of Peter, but it's an integral part of the story, so just bear with me. While Salem was a God-fearing town of peace, the heavily wooded areas outside of the town was known to be home to all manner of supernatural creatures, including 3 witches that lived in one of the caves north of Peters Creek. George Stockburger was a desperate, broken man. He had lost his farm and his family, and had gotten himself kicked out of the church. He was at his wit's end. He decided to brave the evil backwoods and visit the witches, who were rumored to be the best soothsayers in the region. He asked them to look into his future. When would things get better for him? Would he ever catch a break? They did not give him the answer he was hoping for, telling him that his future looked bleak. Deciding to end his life, George threw himself off Peters Mill Bridge, hoping to drown in the water of Peters Mill Pond. But as soon as he hit the water, he had second thoughts. He struggled to get back to shore, his strength failing him. He claimed that the last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was being pulled out of the water by an unseen entity. He believed it to be divine intervention. The mill owner took pity on him and gave him a job as the mill ragman, which was sort of an older form of recycling. George Stockburger worked for the mill until he died, and some say beyond death. It was said that after his death, George's disembodied voice could be heard around town saying, "Rags for the paper mill, ladies?" And what of the witches? Well, apparently Washington took care of them. That's right, President George Washington, during his first term of office, vowed to visit all 13 colonies. He came to Winston-Salem at the beginning of summer 1791. He stayed in the Salem Tavern, which still stands on South Main Street. Washington was so impressed with the area that he decided to stay an extra day, calling Salem, quote, an oasis in the wilderness. Washington spent the day touring the region in greater detail. When he and his tour guide reached Peters Mill Bridge, Washington could tell that something was bothering his guide. After questioning the young man, he was told about the 3 witches. Washington demanded that the man take him to the women. The man took Washington within sight of the cave where the witches lived, but refused to go any further. Washington went on ahead and entered the witches' cave. A short while later, he returned and allegedly told the man, "This was not my first encounter with supernatural or unholy things. However, I hope it is my last." After the president left Salem, some men went to the caves but found no signs of the witches. For the weeks that followed, strange shrieks and wails could be heard coming from the caves late at night, but the witches were never seen again. 100 years after the Wachovia tract purchase, the population of Salem was still only a couple of hundred people. But between 1800 and 1850, 2 events took place that made Salem a revolving door of activity. Washington wasn't playing when he said he was impressed with Salem. Upon returning to the capital, he declared that Salem should be one of the post towns of America. The Post Town Project was established to designate layover areas for families moving west, beyond the 13 colonies. Washington passed away in 1799, and did not live long enough to see this become a reality. But Thomas Jefferson honored his predecessor's wishes. For the next 20 years, the Great Migration, as it was called, brought a constant flow of wagon trails into Salem. Thousands of people per month. The vast majority of these people didn't stay in the area, but simply restocked their supplies before heading west. People of all walks of life came through its thoroughfares, slept in its inns, and visited its shops. In addition to the natural caves that once dotted the landscape of Forsyth County, there are also hundreds of forgotten man-made holes all over the state of North Carolina. At the beginning of the 19th century, America saw its first gold rush in North Carolina, and over the next 40 to 50 years, hundreds if not thousands of mines were dug across the state in search of the elusive mineral. Nearly all of them have been sealed up, and most have been forgotten to time. But they are still there, and every couple of years, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality has to deal with the sinkholes that open up when one of them collapses. But the Carolina Gold Rush also caused thousands of people to migrate to and from the area of Salem. Hundreds came in search of North Carolina gold, and many, having made their riches, left the area just as quickly. Also, the end of the Carolina Gold Rush coincided very closely to the beginning of the California Gold Rush. So many of the experienced workers left for California to work new mines. For those who did decide to stay in the area, very, very few of them were Moravians. And while Salem did not require its residents to be of the Moravian faith, the newly formed Forsyth County decided to establish a town to become its county seat. In 1849, the county purchased land from Salem and formed the town of Winston. 25 years later, when the census officially began in 1870, the two towns had a combined population of just 443 souls. But both areas would grow and expand, blurring the lines between them. By 1913, the area had grown to 25,000 people, and the two towns officially became Winston-Salem. If you've traveled through the heavy construction area of Business 40 lately, you may have noticed a huge arch that looks like part of some giant swing set. That marks the boundary between the original towns of Salem and Winston. In 1875, R.J. Reynolds opened his tobacco company in Winston-Salem. A group of RJR employees reportedly stumbled across one of these deserted shafts back in the 1940s. Back in that time, RJR had dozens of old warehouses that dated back to the formation of the company, but were no longer in use. The story goes that they were told to clean out and secure the basement of one of the old warehouses. The men moved a stack of barrels and were confounded by what they found concealed behind them. A double set of sliding doors were set in the side of the building. The first question that puzzled them was, where did they lead? They were underground after all. And the second unfathomable question was, what in the world were they used for? The doors were huge, 12 feet high and 12 feet across, each. They were chained shut and padlocked. Overcome by curiosity, the men decided to find out what lay beyond the doors. The padlock was extremely old and rusty and fell away easily after using some bolt cutters. They opened the door to find an old brick-lined mine shaft. They retrieved some flashlights and explored the shaft for several minutes. They saw that numerous smaller side shafts branched off of either side, but they stuck to the main shaft for fear of getting lost in the maze. Suddenly, they began to see other lights down there with them. At first they panicked, thinking that perhaps the supervisor had caught them somewhere they ought not to be. But the lights were in front of them, and down some of the side shafts. As they got closer, they saw a dozen or so ghostly miners. The light coming from lamps strapped to their heads. They bustled here and there, working the mine, but paid no attention to the men staring at them. They were covered head to toe in dirt and mud, and by their equipment and dress, the men guessed that they were there from the 1830s or 40s, 100 years before the R.J. Reynolds employees found them at the height of the Carolina Gold Rush. The men ran back to the warehouse basement. They closed the door and found a new padlock to replace the one they had cut. We'll cover more ghost stories of Old Salem in future podcasts, but for more information on this episode, check out Michael Breckner's Haunted Winston-Salem. This episode was researched and written by Jeff Cochran and was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find more information on Jeff's work at adarkerworld.com. You can find everything we're up to at our company, Wreak Havoc Productions, at, you guessed it, wreakhavocproductions.com. You can find Carolina Haints on iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.